Secretary Baker, distinguished speakers, and guests. I'm John Martin, Managing Partner of Baker Botts, and we are proud to sponsor the Baker Institute and to be a part of today's event. As most of you know, members of Secretary Baker's family were among the founders of our law firm many years ago. And in fact, this year, Baker Botts is celebrating our 180th anniversary as a law firm. And it's my pleasure to present to you today's discussion in connection with The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III, a book about our very own Secretary Baker. It was co-written by Peter Baker, Chief White House Correspondent for the New York Times, Susan Glasser of the New Yorker, and Mark Updegrove, President and CEO of the LBJ Foundation, will lead a discussion of the book with Secretary Baker, Ms. Glasser, and Mr. Baker. While you don't need me to remind you that Secretary Baker has enjoyed a long and distinguished career in public service, here are just a few of the many highlights. Secretary Baker is the man who led presidential campaigns for Presidents Ford, Reagan, and Bush over the course of 5 consecutive presidential elections. Secretary Baker is the man who served as Undersecretary of Commerce for President Ford, Chief of Staff for Presidents Reagan and Bush, and President Reagan's Treasury Secretary, where he spearheaded the historic and bipartisan 1986 Tax Reform Act. From 1989 through 1992, Secretary Baker served as the 61st Secretary of State under President George H.W. Bush. And during his tenure, he traveled to over 90 countries and confronted the unprecedented challenges and opportunities of the post-Cold War period. And Secretary Baker is the man who laid the foundation for the reunification of Germany and forged and assembled an unprecedented coalition that forced Iraq out of Kuwait. He organized the Madrid Peace Conference, which for the first time brought Israel and all neighboring Arab countries together. Secretary Baker is also the great-grandson of one of the founders of our firm, Baker Botts, and I'm always proud to call him my partner. We're delighted to have him and all of you with us here today. And I'd like to turn this over to Mark Updegrove, but before that, I've been asked to ask everyone in the audience to refresh your screens as we go through this. Thank you.
John,
Mark?
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thanks very much. What an honor to be conducting this conversation with Secretary Baker and Peter and Susan. And Mr. Secretary, we'll start with you. You had a battle with COVID-19 earlier this year, and we were all worried about you. How are you doing? How are you feeling?
I'm doing great, Mark. Thank you very much. I just got back from my ranch in Wyoming where I was elk hunting with my son and grandson. And so I'm able to do that. So I feel really pretty good. And fortunately, I had what turned out to be a pretty mild case of the virus. But I want to tell everybody who's tuned in, you don't want to get it. It is no fun. It really hammers you. But I'm doing great. Thank you.
Well, as Susan Glasser said before the call, we all want your genes, Mr. Secretary. Susan, Peter, congratulations on The Man Who Ran Washington. My first question is more a lifestyle question. You have out a blockbuster book. We have a president with a penchant for making news, and we're in the midst of the most consequential election of our lifetimes. How are you doing it? How are you balancing all these things? What does your life look like right now?
We may be the only people who are grateful for having to stay home, Mark, because we're sitting in our living room talking to you now, doing all of our book appearances by Zoom, and then, picking up the laptop and, Peter's writing stories for the New York Times and I'm writing my column. But, we're super grateful to you, really, as the godfather in some ways of this book. And of course, to Secretary Baker for enabling us over years. And it took us a long time to write this book.
Well, Peter, what did you want to achieve with the man who ran Washington?
Well, I think first of all, we were surprised to learn when I talked about this way back in 2013, when we sat and talked about who had not had a worthy biography written of them, major figure in American life. And it was really stunning to think that nobody had written something on Secretary Baker. Not only was he Secretary of State during this incredibly consequential time, but as you pointed out, he had his hand in so many other events over the course of really a quarter century in America. And we thought his story tells us a lot about Washington in that moment as well, how things worked, how they didn't work, and how things have changed since then. So we thought that it was a great story about him, but also a larger story about Washington, about America in general.
You know, Susan, I knew about, obviously I read a lot about Secretary Baker's career, but in reading your book, I was reminded of so much more that he accomplished. John Martin enumerated some of the highlights of Secretary Baker's career, but I wonder if you could give us a cursory look at Secretary Baker's very consequential career as a government public servant.
Well, that's right. I mean, you know, I think, first of all, we've been calling it Secretary Baker the world's most successful mid-career switch, you know, not even coming to Washington until your early 40s. And yet, you know, assembling this remarkable portfolio that began with rising in barely 1 year's time from a relatively obscure position at the Commerce Department to running the campaign of the incumbent president of the United States, Jerry Ford, you know, in and of itself, a remarkable thing. But Mark, to your question, you know, from that period when he comes to Washington as Ronald Reagan's chief of staff in the White House, you know, when you look at the record of the number of deals that were made at a time when now we can't even manage to come together as a country to pass a relief package for coronavirus victims in this economic tsunami, you know, Secretary Baker was able to work with Democrats on Social Security reform, on tax reform in 1986. He was, you know, the first thing after the very divisive 1988 campaign was to sit down with Jim Wright and to put an end to the political fighting over U.S. support for the Contra Wars. And of course, he negotiated with Soviets numerous arms control pacts, as well as the framework for the German reunification talks we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of today. So, you know, I could go on, but it's a pretty remarkable record at a time when any deal seems elusive in Washington today.
I want to quote you, Peter, Susan, about Secretary Baker's time as what you call the gold standard for White House chiefs of staff. And you write in the book, he had seen how Washington chewed up and spit out would-be power brokers. It was a tough city. Hubris was an occupational hazard. One day you were the man next to the president. The next day you were cast aside, no longer relevant, even humiliated. So, Mr. Secretary, you not only survived, you thrived. What was the key to your success?
Well, I think, Mark, one thing, I was always imbued with a work ethic. My father and mother always taught me never to start anything that I wasn't prepared to finish, and to finish what I started. But the reason I think that I was successful in those jobs is because I was working for some extraordinarily fine, wonderful, capable presidents of the United States. And they were presidents who thought that the reason they were in Washington leading the country was to do the people's business and to get things done. And that's what drove me, the idea that we ought to get things done for the American people. But I think primarily my success is attributable to the wonderful presidents I worked for, but also the extraordinarily well-qualified assistants who worked with me and who came to Washington with me.
Mr. Secretary, how did you, clearly you don't have a good relationship with the president unless you engender their trust. How did you establish the trust of the presidents that you worked for?
Well, I think the way you do that is to perform for them. and to do what within legal constraints and reason they want you to do, and to do it as expeditiously as possible, but to let them know through your contact with them that they can trust your word, they can rely on you, that if they assign a task to you, you're going to do everything in the world to try and complete that task. I didn't have any trouble, frankly. I worked for three full-time for three wonderful presidents, Jerry Ford, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush, and of course, part-time for a fourth, George W. Bush. And I never had any doubt whatsoever. In 4 years as Ronald Reagan's chief of staff, there was only one time that I felt a little bit like I wasn't appreciated, that they didn't maybe trust me. And, you know, I was the interloper. I came into the Reagan administration having run 2 campaigns against Ronald Reagan. And yet he asked me to be his White House chief of staff. I don't think that's ever going to happen again in American politics. But it says something about the broad gauge nature of Ronald Reagan. With George Bush, of course, I didn't have to establish or prove my trustworthiness. He and I had been friends for 40 years. He was my daughter's godfather, and I had run all of his campaigns, so there was no problem establishing trust there.
Clearly. Susan, you write in the book that Secretary Baker was the most consequential Secretary of State since Henry Kissinger. How so?
Well, you know, look, you could write a whole book, and many people have written books just about this remarkable period of 1989 to 1991, when the hinges of world history were clearly shifting. And unlike this present moment, they were largely shifting in the U.S.'s favor. But, you know, when Peter and I did this book, we had spent 4 years in the former Soviet Union, just a decade after these events. I think we came to a renewed appreciation for the fact that, you know, in hindsight, it may look inevitable, but it wasn't really inevitable. And in particular, when you look at the actions that Secretary Baker took, often, you know, he himself would probably tell us today, he's a, you know, cautious man, but he took some very bold steps to make sure that the German unification, which nobody expected inside his State Department before November 1989, they then acted very swiftly. And by the early winter of 1990, he helped to not only come up with, but to get agreement from feuding allies over a framework for German unification, which was signed just barely 6 months after that, by the next fall. Imagine that Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait sooner. Imagine that Gorbachev had a coup by hardliners sooner. All of these events occurred. And so I think this is a classic example of a Secretary of State who mattered, at a moment that mattered as well, right? It's the marriage of the two.
Mr. Secretary, there was no certainty that the Cold War would end peacefully and lead to a new era in the world. What do you think made the difference during that time in U.S. leadership?
Well, I think that we were consistent. The French and the British and the Soviet Union didn't want to see Germany unified. But it was a strong feeling of George H.W. Bush, President Bush, and Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of West Germany, that the West, writ large, had talked for many years about freeing the peoples of the captive nations of Eastern Europe. Well, some of those people were in the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. And we talked about it for 40 years. Well, when the time came where we had an opportunity to try and do something about it, it would have been a crime not to try. So we tried, and we were fortunately successful over the objections of the British, the French, and the Soviet Union. And as Susan just pointed out, there was a narrow window of opportunity to get this done. We were quite fortunate that we got it done, and there were a lot of people who didn't think it was going to make it at the time.
Peter, you write of Secretary Baker, he was not defined by his era, he helped to define it. Where did James Baker make his most significant mark?
Well, I think continuing what we've just been saying, I think you're right to say it's not inevitable. Like, it could have been so different. This was a very volatile moment. We remember it in hagiographic terms almost because it did work out so well, but it could have so easily gone the wrong way. Gorbachev could have been overthrown earlier. The hardliners could have, come in and sent tanks into the east. They could have stopped. They had 300,000 troops in East Germany at the time of the negotiation that Secretary Baker is talking about here. They could have said no. And it was very easy. It's very easy to imagine a scenario that would have been catastrophic in a lot of ways. Mm. And I think, therefore, you have to say that while the forces of history were moving and they were not, precipitated by Secretary Baker or President Bush necessarily, it was the fact that they figured out how to harness them and steer them in a direction that led to a positive outcome. That was probably the most significant, achievement of this period.
Mr. Secretary, as Peter's alluding to, you presided as Secretary of State when America had triumphed in the Cold War and stood astride in the world as the uncontested superpower. How do you think America is perceived abroad today?
Well, the goal, as I understood it and do understand it, having spent 4 years as Secretary of State, is that you really want to be respected by your allies and feared by your adversaries. I don't think that's any longer the case today, I'm sad to say. I particularly don't think that we are respected by our allies, and there are a lot of differences now between America and her allies. And I think there are some who do not appreciate how very, very important our alliances are to our international well-being and to the well-being, therefore, of our domestic polity. I just think that it's too bad that we have not nurtured these alliances, which have been so important to America over the course of the past 40 or 50 years. I do think we're still perhaps feared by our adversaries, as well we should be. And that part is probably all right, but we're not respected by our allies. And the reason is, I think, sadly, Mark, we're not leading. I've always said that it's really important for America to lead internationally. I firmly believe that when America is engaged internationally and is leading, that we are a force for good, that we are a force for peace and stability. All of our interventions, none of our interventions are for a gain for America in terms of territory or treasure or anything like that. But there used to be a greater appreciation of America's leadership role in the world than there is today because we were doing a better job leading than we are today.
Mr. Secretary, if you were at the helm today, what would you do to ensure that we regain our position as a leader in the world?
Well, I think we have to, the first thing I'd do is see if we can repair our alliances, strengthen them, put them in the kind of good shape they were in during the Cold War and during our period in office. We relied heavily on those. Germany would never have been unified without our relationship with the Federal Republic of Germany. We wouldn't have won the Cold War by ourselves. It was our strong alliances, the transatlantic alliance with Europe and our security alliances with Japan and Korea in the Pacific. And those things all need care and feeding and tending, and that's something we ought to really pay attention to and start doing again as we move into a new administration.
What do you think the greatest trouble spot in the world is? Mr.
I
Secretary?
think that one thing. Well, let me say one thing that I think that's happened that is good, is that finally we are confronting China with respect to its broken promises to the international community. I'm one who worked really hard to try and get China into the World Trading Organization, and we got them in. And we thought, and perhaps erroneously, that this would cause them to change their behavior, but it didn't. And they have not kept their promises to the rest of the world. So I think that's really we're doing well in that regard. You ask about what the biggest threats are facing America. That's not exactly what you asked, but that's part of you. That includes your question.
Sure.
Our political dysfunction is the worst challenge, biggest challenge that we face. We've got to find a way to get back to doing business the way we used to, where the two major political parties would cooperate and compromise to do the people's business. We've got that problem. We've got the problem of the ticking fiscal debt bomb. Nobody talks about it anymore, but it is huge. And when interest rates go up again, and they're going to go up again, you're going to see terrible burgeoning of that already too large fiscal debt bomb.
Says the former Secretary of the Treasury. Peter, I want to go back to Secretary Baker's point about the dysfunction in Washington. You've covered Washington for a couple of decades now, and you've seen a whole lot in your experience. What is the biggest change in Washington since James Baker was in government?
Yeah, I think, look, we shouldn't over-romanticize the past. It was partisan in his era, just as it's partisan today, and there were certainly moments of dysfunction then as there are now. But what's different is that that wasn't the only thing, right? That wasn't the consuming nature of Washington at that time. Secretary Baker will tell you he could be fiercely competitive in an election and then sit down after the election and work things out with Democrats. And the purpose of the election was to get to the point where you could govern. And I think today what you see is in some ways the opposite. The purpose of governing is to set up the next election, and that there doesn't seem to be the incentive structure that there was back then, much less the people to take advantage of it, to compromise. Compromise today is a dirty word. If you compromise, it means you have given up something. You've sold out. You've abandoned your party or your principles. Whereas in that era, in Baker's era, there was a value of political virtue and a political reward for showing bipartisanship, for managing to cross the aisle and say, let's solve big problems. And I think that's what we see as the most significant difference between his Washington and today's Washington.
Susan, as you write in the book, one of the lessons of Secretary Baker's career is, as you write, when the tectonic plates of history move with them. Would somebody as competent and as adaptable as James Baker succeed in today's Washington?
You know, Mark, we've been getting that question a lot, understandably. I do think that, at the moment we're living in, Secretary Baker's reputation for sheer competence, that's a word that we don't hear a lot right now. And that would go far in this or any moment in history. And so, in part, you could read his story as some eternal lessons for how to get ahead and succeed in politics. Don't lie to the press is one particular lesson that Peter and I are appreciative of. But look, competence, always succeeds. But the broader question of to what end? I do think the structural impediments to working together is a fundamental shift in our politics. Right now, nobody is seeking the 51% strategy. People are no longer seeking to persuade others. They're seeking to mobilize those who already agree with them. And I think that, Secretary Baker made a difference in many different ways, not just by, showing up and hard work. He's very modest to say that was the secret of his success, because this town is filled with hardworking, workaholic lawyers who call everybody back. And they don't all get to do those remarkable array of things. I think we'd like to think that a Secretary Baker could come in. But in all honesty, looking at this administration, there's no one who could manage and constrain the situation that we're in right now. That has to be the inevitable conclusion from already having, I think, more chiefs of staff in the role than anyone else, already having more national security advisors in this White House than since the position was created in the aftermath of World War II.
Mr. Secretary, Peter and Susan Wright of Donald Trump, in the book's introduction, he disparaged long-standing alliances, as you alluded to earlier, vowed to rip up free trade pacts, decried American leadership outside its borders, casually embraced a new nuclear arms race, and sought to reverse the globalization that had defined international politics and economics since the end of World War II. He opposed just about everything that Baker and the modern Republican Party supported, and yet they write that while you momentarily considered writing for Joe Biden, you said to them, please don't say that I will vote for Biden. I will vote for the Republican. I really will. I won't leave my party. So, Mr. Secretary, why are you not willing to leave a party that has so manifestly left you?
Well, because the main reason, Mark, is that I am a conservative. Now, when I became Ronald Reagan's chief of staff and the hardline ideologues in the Reagan administration wouldn't give me credit for being a conservative, they beat up on me pretty good. But look, I'm a Texan, I'm a conservative, and I really believe in conservative principles and values. I believe in limited government. I believe in pro-growth economic policies. I believe in a strong defense. I believe in conservative judges. All of these things make a big difference in my calculus. I don't try to defend our current chief executive. I think they quote me, and they're saying he's his own worst enemy, and maybe quote me as saying something more negative than that. But at the end of the day, and let me say one thing at the end of the day, I'm a conservative, and I am concerned about the direction of our country. I have 19 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren, and I want to see the kind of America that I was privileged to enjoy, see that enjoyed by my grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And I look at that Democratic platform, which Joe Biden is going to have to support, and it scares the hell out of me. And I want to say, though, having said that, I like Joe Biden. I've worked with him. He's been down here to the Baker Institute, I think, at least twice. I respect him as a man who likes, as I did, to reach across the aisle and probably try to get some things done. But I worry when I look at that platform about how really radical and liberal it is. So that's why I am going to stay where I am. It's not a party thing. It's really not an individual thing. It has to do with the future direction of our country.
Mr. Secretary, you mentioned you worked with Joe Biden while you were in government. Joe Biden was the senator from Delaware.
Right.
I wonder, you mentioned the dysfunction.
He was vice president too, and I went up there and worked with him and with President Obama and others on the New START treaty, and helped with that a little bit. That's what I meant by that.
No, I understand, and I you know Joe Biden. Again, you've worked with him in his capacity as senator and vice president. You mentioned the dysfunction in Washington. We've alluded to the divisions in our country. Would Joe Biden be good in uniting the country and bringing Washington together as a consensus builder?
It would depend entirely upon the extent and degree to which he is bound to that platform and the deal that he had to cut with the more progressive elements in his party, I think. I mean, Joe is essentially one who would like to sit down and reach across the aisle and find a an agreement, find a deal. Just like I used to do all the time. That's the way you govern. That's the way you ought to govern. Politics is the art of compromise. As Peter said, compromise today is a dirty word. My worry about Joe, frankly, is that he has to pay a lot of attention now to those elements that control the Democratic Party, which has moved very, very far left, and that scares me.
One of the differences in ensuring that there was a peaceful resolution to the Cold War, Mr. Secretary, and you talked about it, is the humility and restraint by the 41st President, George Bush. And frankly, it mirrored your own humility and restraint. I wonder, did the president's performance in the debate last week give you pause about Donald Trump and his ability to be the commander-in-chief of our nation?
Well, I've already told you I had reservations about our current chief executive. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to vote for him because of the larger issue that we just went through. But I thought that debate was a disaster. But I didn't think either candidate was particularly effective. But what I really regretted was the nature of the food fight. That's not the way presidential debates ought to go. And I frankly felt really sorry for Chris Wallace, whom I've known forever and who's a wonderful journalist. But it was terrifically difficult to control the dialogue in that debate. And I thought the debate, in fact, was a food fight.
Having had COVID-19, Mr. Secretary, and experiencing the virus firsthand, how would you have managed the COVID-19 crisis differently than the Trump administration has?
Well, I don't know. Perhaps so. One thing that I think is important to remember is how vital message discipline is when you're running the White House or when you're running a campaign. You ought to make sure that everybody has the story and that everybody sticks to it and that it's uniform. And you don't change your story every so often, and I'm afraid that's what was going on in the briefings on the virus in the press room at the White House.
Right, Susan, what is the legacy of James A. Baker III? How do you think he will go down in history?
Well, Secretary Baker is good at speaking for himself, as we've heard. What Peter and I were struck by in our conversations with him was always a real palpable desire to escape the label of, really having been a political handler, a political strategist, and to be remembered as a statesman and a diplomat. In addition to being a Texan, I'm quite sure that will be a big part of his legacy and his family's legacy. But, what I would say is that I might disagree a tiny bit and say that he was a master political strategist, but in a big definition of politics, whether that was politics in the American sense, running 5 national presidential campaigns, or politics in the international sense, and that he really brought, in fact, a canny politician's sense to the necessities of creating a post-Cold War order that would endure, and that it was politics in the biggest possible sense, defining the age from the end of Watergate to the end of the Cold War.
Peter, what are your thoughts on President or whether on Secretary Baker's legacy? that might have been a Freudian slip.
Well, look, he would have been an interesting president. I think that would have been a different counterfactual in history, right? I agree with everything Susan said. I think he wants, obviously, and he can speak for himself, but I think that he would point to his time as Secretary of State as a statesman. The first of the 2 memoirs he wrote, of course, was about his 4 years as Secretary of State. He didn't want, at first anyway, to focus on the rest of his story. Later, I think, and I'm glad he did, wrote a political memoir about his time, in other jobs. But, I think that it's you quote the book saying he was the most consequential Secretary of State since Kissinger. I could even make the argument more so, honestly. With all respect to Secretary Kissinger, I know Secretary Kissinger has a certain celebrity that's that precedes everybody. But I think that 4-year period in our lifetime, in the post World War II era, stands out as Susan said, the hinge of history changing. So I think that's it's hard to beat that legacy.
Mr. Secretary, clearly you will be remembered as a great statesman, but as Peter and Susan point out, you ran 5 presidential campaigns, which is absolutely stunning. As we approach the presidential election of 2020 and Election Day, do you worry about the soundness of our system?
I really don't, Mark. I think our institutions are strong. I know there are people out there who are really worried about whether we're going to eliminate some of our important institutions or diminish them, but I have perhaps having spent so much time with presidents close up, I have a sense of the restraints that they are subject to. And I just I really don't worry about American democracy. I worry about some discrete things from time to time. I'll have to tell you, you probably think I'm saying this just because I'm a Republican. It's not true. I worry about court packing. Packing the Supreme Court. I worry about attacks on our Constitution that are done in a legal way. But I do not worry about the system surviving. You read a lot nowadays about our democracy is under attack or under assault. There are so many restraints upon a president's ability to get off the rails, if you will, that I really don't worry about that. Our system of checks and balances is quite effective and quite strong, in my view.
I won't ask you who you will vote for, Mr. Secretary, because you've made that pretty clear, but I will ask you, how will you cast your vote?
Where?
Well, how will you do it by mail? Will you go to the polls? How will you physically cast your vote?
No, I'll go to the polls and vote absentee.
Mr. How do you want to be remembered? When the history is written about your service in government, how do you wish to be remembered?
I went to an event after I left after I left government, after Jerry Ford lost to Jimmy Carter in a campaign that I ran for Jerry Ford, or led for Jerry Ford. I went to an event in Lake Como, and there were a number of people there. There were political people and substantive people. And one of the guys who was there was a guy named Bob Shrum. You all may remember Bob. He was a Kennedy political operative, and he was quite accomplished politically. And I remember the moderator asked a question of Shrum that had to do with some substantive issue. And Shrum said, "Look, you ought to ask Baker that question." He said, "He does politics and policy. I just do politics." Well, I'm really proud, frankly, of the fact that I was able to achieve something in politics and in policy. And that's why I entitled my first memoir about my time as Secretary of State, The Politics of Diplomacy, because I think my political experience really helped me in those jobs, both White House Chief of Staff, which is a big political job, yes, but then as Treasury Secretary and as Secretary of State. But you asked me how I want to be remembered. Is that what you asked me? I'll guarantee.
Yes,
I'll tell you how I want to be remembered. I want to be remembered as the guy who ran 5 presidential campaigns for 3 different Republican presidents, and then served as Chief of Staff for 2 different Republican presidents, and then served for almost 4 years as Secretary of the Treasury, and 4 years as Secretary of State, and spent 12 years in Washington, and left unindicted.
I knew it.
That's how I want to be remembered. I think that's my biggest accomplishment, is that I didn't get invited.
Well, I have no doubt that you will be remembered for all that and more. And Mr. Secretary, I can't let you go without asking you, what advice would you give young, aspiring Jim Bakkers who wish to make a career in government service? I know you've talked about the 5 Ps and the importance of hard work, your 5 P rule, which is prior preparation prevents poor performance.
Right.
But even alluded to a humility, you're not telling us some key ingredient to your great success. What would you tell young folks today?
Well, I think that if you want to have a role in policy, you need to understand that politics is the way you get to practice policy. I've always seen the two, and Peter and Susan make this quite clear, in a two discrete pursuits. Politics is one thing. Politics is getting elected so that you can do policy. And therefore, I would tell young people that you ought to figure out some way at some point in your career to do some politics. You don't have to get out and run for the legislature every time the bell rings, like the Dalmatian jumping on the fire truck and so forth. You can wait. You can do something else significant with your life before. This is a theory that George H.W. Bush had, and pretty much that I share. Do something consequential with your life, and then if you want to go into politics, go into politics. But remember that it takes a lot of grunge work. Politics is crossing the T's and dotting the I's. And a lot of it is just grunge work. But that's what gives you the opportunity to practice policy. And I think it also gives you a sense of reward or accomplishment that you've been able to put something back into the system. You put something back into the system not just by practicing policy or exercising policy, but by participating in politics. We are the best country in the world, notwithstanding what you read a lot about how terrible America is and so forth. I tell people I flew all over the world for 4 years, and I had the opportunity to see how other countries and other people hold us in such high regard. Everybody wants to come to America. Nobody wants to leave America. So I don't like to hear all of the negativism that we hear and the condemning of America that goes on. We've got the finest country in the world, and it's a country that every citizen ought to find a way to somehow give something back to.
It's a wonderful note on which to end. Peter Baker, Susan Glasser, congratulations on The Man Who Ran Washington, a remarkable account of Secretary Baker's consequential life. And Secretary Baker, thank you for your remarkable service to our nation.